But let's go ahead and get it started. Good morning and welcome to our webinar introducing a brand new research paper outlining the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on homeownership in Baltimore City. I'm Lori Dunner, Associate Vice President of Housing and Community Development with the National Fair Housing Alliance. NAFA is proud to support the Community Development Network of Maryland, Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, and the UMBC Community Leadership Program in their development of this important research. The COVID-19 pandemic really laid bare the inequities in both health and housing as we were encouraged and sometimes mandated to stay home. Those disparities are exacerbated in formerly redlined communities and for people of color. So this report examines the statistics across racial and ethnic categories and proposes solutions to help create a more equitable housing system for everyone. So without further ado, I will turn this presentation over to Claudia Wilson Randall, Executive Director of the Community Development Network of Maryland.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to also just thank Lori and Sally and Cheryl for their hard work over the past 6 months. I am the Executive Director of the Community Development Network of Maryland. And we are a statewide advocacy organization that envisions thriving communities across Maryland where people of all incomes have the opportunity to thrive. CDN has long been interested in homeownership statewide and in Baltimore City in particular. Our partners and members across the state are working to develop homeownership opportunities, and they're working to both create and preserve homeownership. Many of our members are also HUD certified housing counseling organizations in the state, and they have a particular interest in homeownership and expertise in developing new homeowners. So it is with that lens that CDN also sees this work and this report today. We are especially interested in recommendations for action that our member organizations across Baltimore City can take and can be involved in. So it is that action-oriented research that we're always have an eye towards that can inform our partners' strategies in the homeownership space. So I am not going to spend too much time with lots of formalities, but I want to welcome Sally Scott to the center today. Sally has been a long-time ally of the Community Development Network of Maryland and really led this research that we're working on today. And then we'll also hear from Cheryl Knott at the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And I just really appreciate all your hard work and analysis, Cheryl and Sally, and I'm going to turn it over to you. But thank you so much. I have to say, teamwork makes the dream work, and can't do this work without partners. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. It's been a real pleasure to work with you and Cheryl and Lori on this project. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can jump right into our discussion here. And as a community engaged scholar, I really think of our research as a set of ongoing conversations. This is not the last word on the topic, and we will certainly appreciate your comments and questions as we have a chance to hear those at the end of the presentations. So what was our methodology in writing this paper? We relied on BENIA, Cheryl specifically, to generate the data and the maps based on the data. And those will look at race and ethnicity, population change, owner occupancy rates, and home sales for cash. I will reference some of that data during my presentations, and then Cheryl will dig deeper into the data in the next part of this session. My part in this was to focus on document review. I looked at studies, reports, news stories from Baltimore, and other mixed market cities, as well as state and national sources. Also conducted interviews with nonprofit homeownership experts in Baltimore. I want to thank all of them. They are named in the paper. They may not all agree with our findings or our recommendations, but their insights were incredibly helpful. And of course, Cheryl and Claudia and I and Lori would periodically discuss what we were learning and revise and continue our research based on those discussions. So those were very important part of the process. I want to think a little bit about what we knew coming into this report. A couple of years back, I worked with Seema Iyer at Benia on a report for the Able Foundation about overcoming barriers to homeownership in Baltimore City. That came out in July 2020. We did the research prior to COVID. It came out just after COVID began. And a few months earlier, Alan Malik had written an excellent paper also for Able on changes in racial and ethnic composition and income in Baltimore neighborhoods from 2000 to 2017. And I have found that a very valuable resource as well. So what we learned from these reports was that heading into COVID, Baltimore had been losing population overall, with the highest losses among Black middle class and working class residents. And Black home ownership rates had fallen to 42%. And Black family income had fallen to 48% of white family income. That's from the Alan Malik report. It's a pretty remarkable statistic that the average Black family had less than half the income of the average white family. At a neighborhood level, what this meant was that the number of lower income Black neighborhoods was increasing, and the percentage of higher income white neighborhoods was increasing, meaning that we were losing middle ground in Baltimore. The number of middle income neighborhoods was shrinking. So looking now at a data that includes the COVID period, which we're defining as 2019 to 2022, there's a lot of continuities with what was happening before. Black population continuing to decrease, a major decrease over that 12-year time frame from 2010 to 2022. White population roughly staying the same, a small decrease. Significantly, a real increase in the Hispanic population. And that's focused on Southeast Baltimore, as I think many of us know, but also increasingly in South Baltimore. And in a highly segregated city, these population changes provide critical context for understanding why the texture of our city is so uneven. We know this is underlaid by generations, decades of systemic racism. As many of our neighborhoods continue to lose population investment, while some others are gaining population and investment, and the disparities have become greater over time. So moving into the COVID era, we recognize COVID continues to exist and affect people, but it is not having the same kind of citywide and social and economic effects that it had during its high points. I don't know about you, but I have to kind of push myself to remember back to that time because it was such a strange and painful time. But I think it's really important that we remember the trauma that many experienced, and also the tremendous efforts that individuals and organizations made to meet people's basic needs. I'm sure many people on this call were involved in those efforts. So as the time of this publication's writing, the total number of reported deaths from COVID in Baltimore was close to 2,000, with the peak number of cases occurring in January 2022. But it's more than just cases and deaths. We have to remember that people, whatever impact on them individually, they were losing family members and friends. They were either being forced to work because they had no options or suffering from physical and social isolation. Many people had their working hours reduced. They may have lost their employment, and their educations or their children's educations were disrupted. And we'll talk about COVID's impact on home ownership specifically, but I think it's really important to remember what it did to people's lives and communities throughout Baltimore. Looking at the housing market during COVID-19, I think a piece of good news was that early on, there were projections of a tsunami of foreclosures that were going to occur. I think many of us remembered back to 2008, 9, and 10, but this did not happen. There was a federal as well as a Maryland moratorium on foreclosures that started up March, April 2020 and continued through June, July 2021. Unfortunately, those foreclosure rates have risen since then, but it was not the tsunami that many people were fearing. The housing market in 21 and 22 was extremely lively. There were a lot of properties being sold, a lot of money exchanging hands. After COVID hit, the demand for housing increased quickly, and that helped fuel rising prices. So on the surface, that could look pretty good, like lots is going on in the housing market. However, at the same time, investor activity was high. In the first half of 2022, more than a third of all Baltimore home sales were investor purchases. And we are certainly not critical of all investors. We recognize the value that some bring in rehabbing and reselling properties. But with this predominance of investors, this large influx, there are some bad consequences. There is investor competition with potential home buyers for homes and increases to the ratio of renters to homeowners in vulnerable neighborhoods. And as we know from the homes, we buy homes signs that popped up all over the city, unethical investors can target low information homeowners with offers of quick cash without inspections. And when that happens, it can lead to current homeowners leaving cash on the table. So if we want to try to sum it up, and this is a short period of time from which to draw conclusions, but we can say the market got livelier. Certainly the percentage of mortgage loans originated by Black buyers and white and Hispanic buyers almost doubled, but in important ways, the market became less inclusive. And this is where our interviews with nonprofit homeownership experts helped us understand the specific impacts of COVID on Black homeownership in Baltimore. As housing prices went up, the bottom of the market, how do you get into the market as a first-time home buyer if you're a person of limited means, rose from $75,000 to about $125,000. And at the same time, home buyers were competing with investors. This really hurt people at the bottom of the market, and a lot of those folks are Black home buyers or would-be home buyers. Then, when the interest rates started to climb, the combination of high prices and high interest rates really made it tough for buyers who were making about 80% of area median income to even participate in the market at all. And specifically, single Black women, who are a key home buying demographic in Baltimore, while they were facing the challenges that everybody else faced, many of them were also burdened by student loan debt. And this had a big impact on their ability to afford a home. Want to say a word here about the Hispanic population and home ownership gains. So we know the Hispanic population has been rising in Baltimore, and it's now about 6% of our total. The data that we found, and Cheryl can say more about this, but the data that we found said that from 2019 to 2021, home ownership rates among among Baltimore Hispanic residents increased from 37% to 50%, an apparent increase of 13%. That's huge. However, we don't think this should be accepted without scrutiny. We believe this underrepresents undocumented residents who are less likely to be homeowners, and therefore it's overstating the Hispanic homeownership rate in Baltimore. And also, we learned that there's some serious issues in the housing arena for Hispanic residents of Baltimore, particularly undocumented residents. Landlords find it easy to exploit undocumented renters because the renters are unlikely to report abuses to the police. So then if those folks feel like they want to get into the homeownership market because they're not being treated well in the rental market, they have very few loan options. And the options that exist have high interest rates and fees. So while there's some real progress occurring among that population, there are also some very significant challenges. So I'm going to kind of take us up to this point, and I'll come back and talk about some of our recommendations. But as we look at Baltimore within the larger context of the state of Maryland and throughout the United States, we see that unfortunately, homeownership in a context of systemic racism has not proven an effective solution to the racial wealth gap. And there are many reasons for this, some longstanding and others related to the current housing market, especially during COVID. So just want to highlight quickly institutionalized discrimination in the mortgage lending system. These are all very well documented in national reports. Borrowers of color are more likely to have homes appraised below the contract price during sale or refinancing. And homeowners of color experience lower than average home values in majority minority areas. During COVID, as we've seen, high interest rates and high housing prices making homes harder to afford for people of more modest means, and Black buyers are disproportionately forced to compete with large institutional investors purchasing properties in Black communities. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Cheryl, who will talk in more detail about the data.
All right. Thanks, Sally. So let me get my my slides pulled up, but one of the, I think, kind of key and really important pieces of this particular paper and this research that was conducted was that it was an opportunity to really dig into both the qualitative and the quantitative data. We know that data sometimes can be a very useful tool in trying to get a sense of what is happening on the ground, of measuring changes over time. And so that's kind of where BNIA, the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, kind of came into this project, is taking a look at the different data sets that we have available, data sets that we have tracked for many years, but looking at it under this very specific lens of what can really be observed in the data so that we can pull together data profiles that enable us to really think about what was going on in the city before COVID, during, and whatever this after period is going to be looking like. I think we can all collectively agree we all have a new normal / abnormal in Baltimore and in the country. But so very much interested in both trend data, but also interested in looking at some of that spatial variation. So what can we see in different neighborhoods in Baltimore City as we're thinking about changes in demographics, changes in homeownership trends, and really some of these dynamics that Sally was really talking about, these opportunities for building and maintaining wealth. So we kind of started to take a look at our data inventory and came up with some of these preliminary data sets. So looking at the US decennial census to pull in some demographics of people living in Baltimore. We look to Maryland Property View. This is a data set that is produced and maintained by the Maryland Department of Planning. This gives us owner occupancy, so homes where the owner is living in that property. From the American Community Survey from the US Census Bureau, we're able to pull in home ownership, and very specifically home ownership rates by race and ethnicity. we pulled in some HMDA data. So the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So this is coming to us from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So this is a opt-in data set where we're able to see a little bit of demographic information from folks obtaining a mortgage to buy a home. And then lastly, kind of rounding it out using data that we receive from RB Intel to look at home sales, but very specifically digging into this question of where can we potentially see investment activity happening in Baltimore and using cash sales as a proxy for that. So with all of this, we decided to, again, start from this top-down approach. What are the demographics of our Baltimore neighborhoods? So in this map on the left, this is coming to us from the decennial census, and this shows us race and ethnicity for Baltimore. Each racial and ethnic category receiving its own color, and the saturation, so how deep that color is, indicates a predominance in neighborhoods. And we certainly see, and I think we know this is a lived experience for those of us living and working, operating in Baltimore City, is that we have very segregated neighborhoods. We have many neighborhoods that are very concentrated white, concentrated Black, African American, concentrated Latino. And so this is kind of playing out, and this is a pattern that I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with and seeing, but I want to make sure that we're kind of starting here and looking at this overall spatial pattern of the Black butterfly, where we can see in East and West Baltimore, in particularly, this is where we have our high concentrations of Black population, Black households. So we have in this map on the right-hand side, this is population change. And this is population change that has occurred over the last decade. And this enables us to drill in to these very small areas. These are census tracts that we're looking at here. These are small building blocks of population. And we can definitely see that even though we had an overall decrease of nearly 6% in our population across the city, there's a lot of variation. So we see areas that are marked in these shades of blue where we have increases, oranges and reds, decreases. So we're able to pull out and see, especially as we're relating this data back to our race and ethnicity map, that we're seeing a lot of population loss in these predominantly Black neighborhoods. We're seeing population increases in neighborhoods that have been predominantly white. And then we're also seeing down here in the southeastern part of the city, increases in population in areas that have predominant Latino households. So moving along to that owner occupancy, and again, this is that data set that measures, are people that own a home actually living in it? And with this map, the darker colors on the map show us the areas that have the higher rates of owner occupancy. But again, we have a lot of variation across Baltimore City. And so each of these color codes on the map is like a 20% bucket increase. And we do see that there are some areas in the center core of the city in East and West Baltimore that have very, very low rates of owner occupancy, under 20% in some of these areas. So of course, you can take a look at this data and think about vacancy. So there are some properties that are not habitable in Baltimore, but we do know that there are a lot of areas that have homes that are habitable, homes that are attractive, homes that could be made available for home buying, that are kind of leaning more and more towards being converted into rental properties. And so what does this look like over time? Okay, so this map on the left here enables us to start looking at that change in owner occupancy. So again, reds, oranges showing decreases from 2019 to 2020. We do see increases in the areas that are marked as blue. So these are areas kind of in central Baltimore, extending from like Station North, Lower Charles Village out through Remington and Hamden. We do see some increases that are down and along the water, kind of around Patterson Park. And so kind of coupling this with so the owner occupancy rate, coupling that with the home ownership rates. So what percentage of households are households where folks are living in or have a property that they own? We do see this variation. So looking at the same time period, 2019 to 2021, we are seeing some slight increases. So here we can see that for Black households, there was a 1.1 point value increase from 2019 to 2021, but a larger 2.3 percentage point increase during the same time period for white households. But one thing that we want to note here is that there is still a measurable difference in the home ownership rates for Black households versus white households. So we can see this this trend playing out spatially on this map, but we can also really dig in and think about, well, what are these trends telling us kind of over time? So pulling in that data that I mentioned from HUNBA, so this is the rate of mortgage loans that have been originated or approved by race and ethnicity. So this is that opt-in program where folks can kind of mark and indicate if they'd like to participate, have their demographics shared. So this is not all homes sold in Baltimore, but we do know that this is a percentage of it. And we do see that the rate of mortgage loans originated increased from 5.5 per 1,000 population to 10 per 1,000 population for Black home buyers. We do see another rise of 0.7 to 1.3 for Latino home buyers. And then we also see another increase, 7.9 to 13.8 for white home buyers. So as Sally indicated, we are seeing some activity, we are seeing some movement over the past few years, but we're still seeing some differences in this data when we're pulling it out by race and ethnicity. So the type of home sales was also something that we dug into, looking at, again, very specifically, what's a percentage of home sales that are done for cash? So this is that proxy for investor-based home purchases versus a home sale that might be done with that mortgage. And so this map here shows the different areas that have had at least 5 homes sold in 2022. And the darker the color, this is that higher percentage of these potential investor properties. And so that number that Sally kind of put out there, about 1/3 of home sales in 2022 were for cash. And we can see that there are some concentrations, especially out in Southwest Baltimore, that indicate there's a lot of investment that is happening where folks are buying up properties, and this does have implications for changing that overall, like renter to homeowner, owner occupied ratio. And it does have those implications, in terms of thinking about, overall wealth that can be generated for families and for these properties in neighborhoods. So before I turn it back to Sally, I think there was just, this one, thing, this key takeaway to really highlight from the data. And we know that the data is not perfect. This is exactly why it's great to have all these qualitative and quantitative pieces coming together to really understand what might be some gaps, some biases in the data, and figuring out ways of really just telling that meaningful story in a way that can be relevant to policymakers, relevant to, government, to philanthropy, but then also meaningful for folks that are, experiencing changes, want to buy a home. But the key piece here is that you really don't have that same level of benefit. Black homeowners are not consistently benefiting from that creation of generational wealth through homeownership at the same rates that we're seeing for white homeowners. This is something that predates COVID. This is not brand new, but it is something that has certainly been exacerbated by the pandemic. So we're seeing this in the data. This is something that is readily apparent. There are spatial patterns. We are seeing some interesting things in terms of the trends, but ultimately that's kind of the key thing that is jumping out to me, is that we're still seeing these disparities. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to turn it back to Sally. And again, just a quick reminder, these slides with all of the content will be made available, this recording as well, in case anyone's out there taking some furious notes out there. But so with that, pass it back to Sally.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to continue to share here. And okay. So where we left off was the enduring racial wealth gap in Maryland and throughout the United States. What you might be wondering is there any good news? There was these slight upticks in the homeownership rate, not really that large, and also the Black homeownership rate remained 18 points below white. But I think the good news during COVID was that people took a step back. This was a severe disruption to all of our lives. And what we found is that a number of activists, nonprofit developers, community engaged scholars, and others took a step back to really re-examine our housing system in Baltimore. And I think we were finally able, after many, many years, to fundamentally rethink our most severe housing challenge, which is vacant houses and lots. For many years, those were treated almost like just like a feature of the landscape. Oh, isn't it terrible? Without there being the willingness to fully examine or fully tackle this problem. And we saw.
Sally, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to let you know that you are sharing your screen in presenter mode, which means that we can see all of your notes and everything. So I don't know if that's what you're intending to do, but wanted to give you the heads up.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm going to go in and share screen again. Let's see. Okay. How's that?
Looks great.
Perfect. Sounds
Thank
great.
you.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't mind you seeing my notes, actually, as a community engaged scholar, but it's probably more interesting just to see the visuals. Okay, so this slide is showing two reports that I think were both really significant, by Fight Blight Baltimore, Anatomy of Baltimore's Blight, and by Build Rebuild, Whole Blocks, Whole City. And we realize there's significant differences in some of the approaches these reports are taking, but in both cases, they were saying the status quo is no longer acceptable. And they were building on other work, a Hopkins report that described the cost of vacant houses in Baltimore as $100 million a year, which is unacceptable. And also there was a task force that was looking at the creation of a land bank in Baltimore. So when you really add up the impact, I think, of all these reports, there is finally, after many, many years, a widespread agreement that current government and private sector housing policies and practices are really not helping our city the way they should, and in some cases are damaging them and have to change. So just as a preface to our recommendations, really want to encourage you to read the report. So we're not going to list out all our recommendations here. It would be too long to do so. But I think some of the fundamental understandings that we got from COVID and maybe we had before, but intensified during COVID, is housing is not just housing. It's a place where we find space and safety and self-expression and connection. And during COVID, many of us, or some of us, did not have that opportunity. And when we lack a home, or our homes are not in a stable condition or area, it becomes more difficult to do many other things in life, to get an education, to find a job, to stay healthy, and just to fully participate in the life of our communities. So it became clearer, I think, and I think that's why these reports came into being, that if we want Baltimoreans to thrive, we need to dramatically improve our city's housing access and conditions. That means helping people stay in homes, as well as providing new homeownership opportunities, and really focusing on the collective capacity of our public, nonprofit, and for-profit housing partners. Our recommendations do not include federal level recommendations. That would be wonderful if we saw considerable improvements coming out of the federal government. I think the way things are now, that's not going to happen in the near future. We hope in the further down the line it will. So we're really focusing our recommendation here on community-based organizations, regional organizations, city government, and state government. So I'm not listing out the recommendations, but I want to talk about the 4 buckets in which they fall and highlight a few things that we put into those buckets. So starting from the megaphone in the top left corner, it is critical to inform people of the scope of the problem. As I mentioned before, there was the study that showed that vacant housing is costing us minimum of $100 million a year. Perhaps even more consequentially, it's just the impact on people's lives when it's very hard for them to, if they're lower on the income level, to afford a home, and decent rental opportunities are also lacking. So providing more inclusive housing and particularly homeownership opportunities means admitting that we have a problem that requires large-scale, coordinated place and people-based solutions. Second bucket. This is not just about attracting people to Baltimore. That's certainly important. That's one of our buckets as well. But we wanted to really prioritize helping existing homeowners and renters stay in homes that are safe and habitable. There are a number of tools out there already that we can use to do this. They need to be, better funded, better advertised, better connect with our residents. Also, we want to talk about, and I think during the question and answer period, I'd asked Lori to address the special purpose credit programs that are specifically designed for populations of color who have been most harmed by systemic racism in Baltimore. This means we can legally target resources to our communities of color, and that there are programs being designed along these lines as we speak, and that's something we need to fully consider for Baltimore. We also want to attract people. We know Baltimore's can be a great place to live. However, it feels like we're often attracting folks only to certain kind of new and shiny developments. We have a number of those going up, particularly around the harbor. But we want to attract people to a wide range of neighborhoods in Baltimore. I know Live Baltimore has been doing this for many years by providing a diverse array of housing options. So including the classic single-family home, row home, we need to give a lot more support to co-housing and cooperative developments, which are in many cases, more affordable. And it will be to be able to do this, well, it'll be essential to develop legal and financial tools and structures to acquire and dispose of large numbers of vacant properties. And those are specifically addressed in our recommendations, also in some of the reports that we highlighted. Finally, building capacity and collaboration among city government, nonprofits, and for-profit partners. This cannot be overstated. We have a tremendous community development talent in Baltimore, but we often also have a zero-sum mindset that fosters competition within sectors and between sectors and hinders collaboration. If we agree, and I think the data and our study and the many other studies that have been done support this, that this is an all hands on deck moment, we have to find a way to better work together. And that requires leadership from the top and participation at all levels. So just to sum up and look ahead, impact of COVID, we've seen that it made the housing market more lively, but not more inclusive. It actually excluded many Baltimore residents. And we know from COVID, and we hope COVID's our last and only pandemic, but we can't ensure that. So we know that having a decent home is a necessity, not a privilege. And that our housing market needs to become more inclusive and more affordable. I think it's really good news and important that among a variety of players, during COVID, a consensus developed that our inequitable, racist housing status quo is no longer acceptable. We were not talking this way 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We know that to make homeownership more affordable and inclusive will require transforming Baltimore's huge stock of vacant properties into a resource that benefits all our residents. That's a huge takeaway for me, and I'm hoping that there are enough of us with the capacity and the willingness to make this happen. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn this back to Claudia Wilson-Randall.
Right, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Sally and Cheryl, for your excellent analysis and work on this again. I think it's great that we are also bringing together so many discussions that are connected to homeownership with this report. It is fortuitous timing of a lot of national work as well as work on the local level that is coming together. So I'm really looking forward to, as you said, a more collaborative spirit and less siloed and competitive spirit, or zero-sum game, Sally. But thank you again for all your work on this. There were a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to ask. Actually, some of them are in the Q&A, and our others are in the chat. Actually, Ruth Griffin, you asked about the study and the cost of vacants. I will put the link to that in the chat. I also want to just say that the Community Development Network of Maryland, we have all of the sort of top research reports in our knowledge bank on our website, and you can just click on them and go right to them. The other questions in the chat, one is specifically for Cheryl, was just about the HMDA mortgage origination data was for borrowers in Baltimore City and the metro area. Is that correct?
You're on mute, Cheryl.
We can't hear you. Okay, but actually I see you answered the question in the chat. But yes, I'll make sure that we have that. But yes, we just pulled the data from the Baltimore City, so that's good. Also, I just want to say I did drop a link in the chat for the entire report. It's a link to our Google, and if you have problems with that, just please feel free to email me after the webinar. I'll put my email if you're having trouble accessing the Google Drive or anything like that. But I did put the link to that. It's also on the bottom of our website, so you can download the report. The other piece that I want to mention was asked, Agatha also asked two other questions. One is her interest in understanding the participation of banks and community lenders in special purpose credit programs. Actually, Lori, do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, and Sally did mention that she wanted me to kind of say a little brief something about special purpose credit programs. I'm going back. I'm just if I'm hedging here, it's because I'm reading Agatha's question specifically, so I can make sure that I address it. Now, special purpose credit programs, for those of you who are not familiar, were made allowable by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. So for 50 years now, lenders have been allowed to create a program specifically for an economically disadvantaged group of people who share a common characteristic, such as a protected class. So in layman's terms, a lender can create a mortgage program or a down payment assistance program for Black individuals, for Hispanic Latino individuals. We've seen this in a variety of different ways. Many of you may be familiar with lending programs for persons with disabilities. That is a special purpose credit program. We've seen small business lending programs for women or people of color. Those are also our special purpose credit programs. So these types of programs are not confined to the mortgage lending space. They can be used in a variety of different ways. But they have not been used much to date for a variety of reasons. Part of that has to do with HUD and the regulatory agencies kind of having a lack of guidance available for lenders. Another piece of it has to do, frankly, with the environment of this country in terms of racial, racial issues and racial challenges. Of course, again, using the mortgage program for disabilities as persons with disabilities as an example, I've not heard anyone push back against those at all ever. I've never heard one single person say, why do those people get special treatment? But again, when you start introducing racial and ethnic types of categories into it, there will be challenges. And so that hesitancy has been a big barrier for a lot of mortgage lenders. We tend to see them now in place-based rather than people-based. So that means this mortgage program, this down payment assistance program is available for this geography, not this category of persons. The ones that we are seeing that are racially explicit tend to be offered by community development financial institutions, CDFIs, or nonprofits. Happy to say that there are these programs operating and in development in the Baltimore area. And we are continuing to see them, even though we're in a kind of fraught legal environment and racial environment, we are seeing these programs all across the country being introduced. So I think Claudia dropped in the chat some information. NAFA has done a lot of work in this space, a lot of advocacy. We have a website. I'll drop a link to that in the chat as well. It's the SPCP Toolkit. And that really lays out step by step everything the lender needs to know in order to create their own special purpose credit program. So happy to expand on this for anyone who has more questions.
Great, and I'm actually really looking forward to talking more in depth about special purpose credit and having that as a continuing thread. Also, I see Dan Pontius is on, but with the Housing Committee of the Baltimore Metropolitan Committee, just talking about special purpose credit and really lifting it up as a strategy. Thank you, Beth Harbor, for putting the link into the Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities report estimating the cost of vacants as at least 100 million. That's great. I also wanted to recognize Kim Lane. You had a question about, can a map be created that shows the percentage of occupied commercial properties or number of businesses? It'd be great to see if strong commercial corridors strengthen homeownership and lower residential vacancy. And Cheryl, I think we still can't hear you, but you put in here that yes, we certainly could create a map that can pull out commercial versus residential VBNs and vacant building notices from our data, and that would be a great idea. And I do think that there's, there's probably some correlation there, and I think there's been a lot of work that we haven't also talked about strengthening home ownership through investing in other amenities, not always investing in home ownership directly, but the investment in small business, investment in parks, invested in other amenities across the city, schools and other. I am also interested actually in the discussion about the intersection of home ownership with other investments as the city grows, as it changes, actually, and as it becomes more ethnically mixed, right? There's also questions about sort of what are some of the intersections that may actually help us increase home ownership. Sally, do you want to comment on that or any of that?
Yeah, and can you all hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I was just going to tell.
Okay, cool.
Yay!
So apologies, tech is always kind of crazy, but yeah, so Kim, to kind of your comment and question, that was actually something that BINIA used to include in its vital signs reports. So our annual report, it looking at different indicators for like economic and workforce development, but certainly an indicator that is pretty well related to our housing data, and definitely a measure that I think is one that I think would be fantastic for us to be able to track again. It was a measure that was discontinued because of some crazy data methodology issues about a decade ago, which I believe have been solved. So I think this is something that we want to hear this type of feedback of. This is a question that we have. What will the data tell us? Is there going to be something really meaningful and interesting that can come out of it? So thank you for that idea suggestion. I feel like I've got some homework here of getting some of this data pulled. And just really quickly, I want to see if I can grab this and put it into our chat. But I was going to say last year, but back in 2022, BINIA did its Community Change Project, which looked at changes in Baltimore's neighborhoods since 2010. And one of the things that we looked at, we had our map of population change, which we kind of use as one of our number one indicators of community health. Are people moving in, or are they moving out of a neighborhood? But we overlaid that with capital improvements, so to look at the spatial relationship there. But then we also pulled in some private real estate investment data for us to really start thinking about, well, what is this relationship here? So I'm going to hopefully grab that in about 30 seconds and put that into the chat as a resource for folks.
So Claudia, you asked if I had anything to say about the connection between housing and other areas of work. I think it ties back to the issue of the need for us to work, less competitively and more collaboratively. I think we often see, ourselves in like housing in competition with other areas for funding, right? But if you care about kids' school performance or people's health. All kinds of things really cannot thrive if they are, struggling to stay in a home, struggling to find a home. So, and it really did. I think that is really one of the huge lessons that we learned or relearned during COVID. And I appreciate that we're not alone in the wilderness on this, that there are a lot of people making this point around town, and that our mayor seems interested in the build rebuild effort to comprehensively tackle vacancies. We're not taking stands on these different reports, but I think the mayor's willingness to look at a very comprehensive, large scale effort to address the vacant housing is really the direction, is the kind of approach that we need to think about if we're not just going to pick off a few neighborhoods at a time, but really look more broadly than that.
Thank you. Does anybody want to come off mic and ask a question? I really appreciate folks answering questions in the chat and the Q&A. That's great. But if anybody has a question they want to ask verbally, that'd be great. It's 10:57. We've got 3 minutes.
There is one more question in the chat. It says, in the qualitative work, did trust of traditional models of home ownership arise at all versus land trust, co-op models, et cetera?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think, and I think I mentioned one of our recommendations talks about the need for more support for cooperative housing. Land trusts would be part of that. The market alone, while it's a very powerful tool and will continue to be a part of the solution, the market alone is not solving our home ownership or our housing problems more broadly. I think we've known that for some time, but it's just become clearer and clearer, especially in a period of crisis. And we do have efforts right around Baltimore that are working, community land trusts that are forming. We have some existing cooperative housing. We have people who are interested in doing more of that. And it just makes, perfect sense to me that we offer those opportunities that not only reduce initial costs to the buyer, but eliminate dramatic price increases in the future, right? There is kind of collective ability to control the increase in price. We just can't pretend anymore that the market is going to do the job for us.
And the other question in the chat is, what is the city of Baltimore doing to stop the displacement of Black people in predominantly Black neighborhoods? I do think that the work that Sally just described around community land trusts, and I mean, I think like the city, what is the city doing? I think that's a complicated question. I don't know that the city of Baltimore, like what the city of Baltimore has been doing in terms of helping helping individuals out of tax sale hold on to the homes that they have, working also to help people access resources that would help them remain in the homes that they are in, as well as I think efforts around the community land trust and land bank efforts. Those are not efforts that are being led by the city. It's being led by advocates throughout the community. Some like CDN and some in partnership, community-based organizations, city council members. So I think that's a dynamic question, but I think that there are a variety of efforts to help prevent displacement.
That's a good answer. Claudia. It's not something. It's lots of things. It's all of the things, many of which we've described in today's presentation. Others are described in the report and all of the organizations working throughout Baltimore. So to that end, we're basically at time now. I see no more questions in the chat, and folks are slowly starting to depart for their other obligations. So on behalf of the National Fair Housing Alliance and all of our partners here today, I want to thank you all for tuning into this presentation. The links in the chat there's been some resources there, and we will follow up with everyone who registered today to make sure that you have your own copy so you can see the report, read it, download it, share it with your networks. Again, we appreciate you so much for participating today. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon, and stay safe and dry and warm with this crazy weather that we have coming our way. Take care.
And again, special shout out to Sally Scott and Cheryl Knott and Lori Benner for their partnership in making this report and this presentation possible. Thank you all for your help and support.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.